you've already lost. Because if you're coming at situations where your ego is in control, it's going to control what you say, what you think, how you act, and your ego is at the forefront of trying to prepare for battle every single time that you have an argument with your spouse or your children or something like that. You're always going to be in a defensive posture all the time when your ego is putting its dukes up, ready to fight all the time. We all want to be the best parents to our children, but what happens when your ego gets in the way of you being the best parent? Today, I want to talk about how a lot of parents are losing that battle between their ego and their self when they're talking about raising their children, and a couple of things that you can do to change those behaviors with yourself. So the first thing that we need to do is define ego. And ego is the inner projection of how you view yourself in the kind of like a mirror that you would hold up to the world. So what you want everybody else to see projected outward toward the world would be your ego. And yourself is just who you are naturally. Who you are naturally when nobody is looking, and it's just you by yourself. So have you ever seen two kids, I'm talking about like maybe 1 year old, playing with each other, how one might see the other one crying and they're a little empathetic and they'll start crying too, or when they can see that one of the children is upset, they want to give them a toy to pacify them, or even pick up a pacifier and put it in their mouth. It's because deep down inside they know that empathy, that caring, that outwardness toward another human being to make them happy is something that's embedded deep down inside of us. It's embedded with us, from birth. We want to just make sure that people are comfortable, they're happy. And seeing somebody who's upset makes us upset, brings us to a level of anxiety that we want to cure that. So we want to stick a pacifier in somebody's mouth. But your ego doesn't allow you to do that. Your ego is kind of like, I think that the best example of that would probably be my glasses here. See, in my glasses, you can see that there's a mirror there. And beyond those mirrors, behind them, you can't see what color my eyes are. You can't see what my expression is. You can't see if I'm crying or upset. So your ego is what you allow everybody to see and what you project from your inner self, like a mirror. You can't see beyond the mirror. You can't see beyond these glasses. And your ego would be what you project to the world. Now, why is that important? Because your ego is how you want the world to see you behave or react or respond to when somebody makes you upset or you're happy about things. But the problem is that the ego only responds to what other people want you to see. Okay? So let's use this as an example. If we were parents, if I had a child and the child came to something with me and happens to be that the child was right about something and I was clearly wrong. Well, in that instance, my ego wouldn't allow me to concede and say I was wrong and you were right, because my ego would always want to be right. It didn't matter what the facts are. Even presented with hardline facts, your ego is always going to tell you you're right and you need to argue your point until you're blue in the face, until the other person concedes, whether you're right or not. All right? So that's a big problem. But now that we've identified what your ego is and what your self is, you should ask yourself a couple questions like, do you let yourself shine through, or do you let your ego lead you around? And I think that a lot of parents, whether they're in a co-parenting situation or just in a regular relationship with each other, let their ego lead them around. They let it lead them around in the sense that they parent their children like that all the time. any parent that tells your kids, and if you were born anytime before last night and you've heard your parents say, because I said so, that's an egotistical saying without an explanation behind it. Because I said so for the sake of saying I said so is an egotistical thing to say. And our parents, all of our parents have said that to us. But what we're trying to be aware of is the fact that I don't have to let my ego lead the way, okay? And if I were in that situation and I needed to explain it to my children, there are situations where I'm just going to say because I said so, then, and that's just the end of the conversation. But for instances where you can have conversations with your children, you don't want that ego to come out to the point where you're leading with that, okay? And the reason for that is that your ego can never be wrong, right? When you're leading with your ego can never be at fault, which means that I can never be at fault. If I'm going to have a conversation with somebody and we're arguing about something, despite whatever the facts are, even if I'm dead to rights wrong, your ego would never allow you to be wrong. So instead of conceding to that and saying I was wrong and you were right, I'm just going to keep on arguing with it until you back down or we just never talk again. And that's what the ego does. And the ego is always looking to impress people. All right. So, a lot of times teenagers, they're around a group of their other teenage friends. They're going to want to do things that have their ego show and impress their friends about how high they can jump on their bike, or I can scale this wall, or I can get on top of the supermarket roof at night when it's closed, and all of those things that kids do. That's their ego telling them that they need to impress people. And the last thing is that ego forces you to be the opposite of self. And like I said in the beginning, think of self as that, 1-year-old that just wants to please other people and pacify them, and think of others before you think yourself. And, that word self is an important word because it describes our inner person, yourself, your inner self. And ego is just the outer, the projection of who you are, all right? And because ego forces you to be the opposite of self, anytime that you're ever thinking of somebody else, it automatically is diametrically opposed to who the ego is. Self is content with itself. It doesn't need to impress anybody. If I'm content with myself, I don't need to make sure that I have these grandioso things that I say to impress other people, or, by that nature hurting somebody else because I need to make fun of them or target them to be a bully and show myself as higher than they are. When you're content with yourself, you don't need to do any of that stuff to other people. And self is always giving, and it always wants to do more. When you're in a selfless mode, that's why I said this word self is so important, because it describes so many things about the inner portion of your personality, and it's a reflection of who you are from the inside out, not from the outside. Okay, and self is empathetic, and like I said, it wants to help others because it sees that when people are in need, it wants to do something, right? And it wants to do something for the sake of others without the benefit of me. All right. So if I was thinking from myself perspective, I would want to go help on a soup kitchen line, or feed the hungry, or buy meals for people who are hungry, or enlist the help of myself for Habitat for Humanity to build homes for the homeless, or just to volunteer at local churches, or do something that's selfless for myself, but for the benefit of others. And if you're thinking with your ego would never allow you to do that, because those tasks that would be so far beneath you that it wouldn't allow you to be able to do any of that stuff. So when we make a decision with our kids and we don't break down or change our decisions and we're thinking with our ego, I can't ever be wrong in front of my kids, ever. I can't be wrong in front of my spouse. If my spouse and I are disagreeing about something, I can't concede to her. I can't concede to my kids, because then it'd be admission of guilt, right? And I can't do that. All right, so what can you do about this? All right, so if you can identify that you're confronting your spouse or your children from the aspect of ego instead of self, what can you do about it? Okay, so the next time that you wind up getting into either a disagreement or a fight or a knockdown, drag out hockey fight with your spouse or your kids, you know, take a real honest look at the reason why you're arguing. All right, do a self-evaluation of why you're so upset right now. Okay, and that reflection period for you to just say, time out, I need a second to go to the bathroom, reorganize my thoughts, and just get my stuff together. All right. And the reason for that is because you need to identify why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. All right. Because this is going to identify whether or not you're thinking with your ego or yourself. All right. So if I'm upset because I feel like somebody wronged me in what they said, and I feel like they got one up on me, then you're fighting with your ego, because your ego wants to get one ahead of them. All right. And it never wants to accept defeat, ever. All right. And that's always going to be your ego lashing out at the other person. Okay. So if you can't identify the fact that your ego is up in front and it wants to be right here to lash out and be a reflector for every single thing that comes at you, this being the mirror and the ego, then you've already lost. Because if you're coming at situations where your ego is in control, it's going to control what you say, what you think, how you act. When you're thinking about self and you're being selfless and you're putting more thought into the argument from the perspective of the other person, where you try to determine whether or not something that maybe you said is upsetting them, where you can kind of back it down a little bit and say, hey, I'm sorry if I said something that hurt you. I know we're trying to get through this, but you hurt me when you said this, and can we try to move on from there? But to not be aware that your self isn't up front and forward with trying to resolve situations, and your ego is at the forefront of trying to prepare for battle every single time that you have an argument with your spouse or your children or something like that, you're always going to be in a defensive posture all the time when your ego is putting its dukes up ready to fight all the time. And like I said, self is that so important word. And think about how many things that it can describe: myself, yourself, his self, herself, themselves. It's the inner projection of how you feel on the inside. All right. And self, it's the root of self is how you were when you were like 1 year old. Self doesn't want to hurt anybody. Self just wants to, learn and be curious and observe. All right. And ego wants to be at the forefront and be first all the time and have the right answer, whether you have it or not. All right. And that's a huge problem when you're trying to raise kids. It's a huge problem in the sense that if you can't ever concede or let your kids, be right occasionally when they actually are, they're always going to feel like every single time they come to you with a problem or, something that's counter to what you're talking about, they're never going to offer their suggestions on anything because they're always going to say mom or dad are right about everything all the time, whether I'm right or not. All right. So then at that point, why even bother bringing anything to you? So like I said, if you go into an argument or disagreement and you can give yourself just 2 seconds to disassociate yourself from the argument, and this becomes easier and easier where you can have disagreements and arguments with people and you don't even have to think about it because you've practiced doing this, where you can self-evaluate and figure out whether or not, am I thinking with my ego or am I thinking with self? And if you can just, in the beginning, take a couple seconds, like I said, go to the bathroom, organize your thoughts, figure out, am I arguing from my ego perspective or am I arguing from self? And if I can identify why I'm doing that, then I can at least have an argument that's at least honest with the other person, all right? Or at least myself, right? Because I know that at that point that I'm arguing for, my ego's benefit as opposed to, thinking about the other person and trying to resolve a situation coming at it that way. And so I hope that, given enough opportunities to be able to identify whether or not you're arguing from ego or self will help you to, pull you back from conversations where you just want to lash out all the time, and give you an opportunity to be able to disengage from those conversations and then come back at them where you're ready to de-escalate those situations instead of just continually just keep on escalating them. And it's never going to come to a good conclusion if you continue to keep on doing that. So anyway, I just wanted to film this video. Listen, it's been a really, really long time since I've been able to get outside to film. We just went through like a 5 or 6 day heat out here where it was over 100 degrees. This is the first day that it's been in the 80s, and boy, it feels nice to be outside. So anyway, I hope you guys got a lot of benefit out of this. And until next time, life isn't hacked, it's built, and I will see you next time. Bye.